Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final installment of the Bridging the Divide discussion series. Over the past several weeks, you've heard from a number of speakers with many different accolades and accomplishments. Now, with 5 days leading up to the presidential election, we wanted to provide you the chance to hear from students who are equally engaged in the political process. They may not have written any academic articles, published any books, or even run for president of the United States, but they have experiences and opinions that are equally important in the larger conversation of civil discourse in America. I extend my gratitude to the Provost Office of Notre Dame, the Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, and the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy for inviting us here and putting together a wonderful series. I am Greg Miller, co-president of BridgeND, a club on campus for ideologically diverse conversations. On top of hosting a wide variety of events, BridgeND hosts weekly meetings on different policy topics with group conversations with anybody from any ideological makeup able to attend. BridgeND was founded in 2016 and soon became a national organization, BridgeUSA, which now boasts 30 chapters and counting. All of our panelists tonight are involved with Bridge in some capacity, and I also want to thank them all for being here. Throughout our conversation, we invite attendees to submit questions to us through the tab on the ThinkND webpage. I also want to mention that a little over an hour ago, 2 groups of student demonstrations occurred on Notre Dame campus. One protesting the nomination of Notre Dame alum Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, and one a celebration. These students' passion are applauded, and their ability to civilly protest is also applauded. And I think it was just worth noting that before we kick off our conversation, the sort of student involvement we have at Notre Dame. Now, I want to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. And as you do so, talk about how you became involved with Bridge, and more specifically, how you became involved with being an activist for civil discourse on university campuses. And so we'll start with you, Riya, and then we'll go to Jane, Emily, and Ross on cue in that order.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to everyone for having us today. My name's Riya Shah, and I'm the Director of National Engagement, serving on the Executive Cabinet of Student Government. I'm currently a sophomore at Notre Dame, studying finance, political science, and constitutional studies. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky originally, but on campus I live in Walsh Hall, so shout out to any wild women who might be joining us today. On campus, I'm also the Director of Finance for College Democrats, Walsh Hall Council, and for BridgeND. So when I first got to campus, I experienced a sort of culture shock in regard to the general political attitudes I encountered on ND's campus, just because they contrasted so significantly with what I was used to back home. And my initial instinct was to keep my thoughts to myself so that I wouldn't be seen as an anomaly or an outsider, but I realized it was important for people like me to still voice our opinions and maintain that political dialogue that incorporates diverse views. So BridgeND provided me with the perfect environment to have those conversations in an open and respectful manner, so I could hear not only voice my own opinions, but also hear the thoughts of my peers and where they came up with the ideas that they have as well. So it's been a really great part of my college experience so far, and it's a large part of what enabled me to take on my role of Director of National Engagement with Student Government this year.
And to Jane.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jane. I'm a 3rd year at Emory University in Atlanta. I'm a history major, and I think just how I got involved with BridgeUSA was towards the end of my freshman year. There was an incident on Emory's campus involving a group called the Students for Justice in Palestine. They had hung up mock eviction notices on many students' doors, including Jewish students who were quite upset by the gesture. And, you know, as someone who didn't know a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I was just very confused and wanted to know more. And so a friend and I, we set up a panel in about the span of a week to kind of just talk about the incident on campus and the broader global issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I really enjoyed that experience so much that I just decided, you know, oh, let's start a branch of BridgeUSA on campus. And from there, you know, we kind of took off. I've also interned at a nonprofit called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which does a lot of free speech advocacy on college campuses. And that was something that, got me really passionate about open expression, because I think, of all the myriad issues that there are in the world today, if we can't even talk about them with each other and disagree civilly, how are we supposed to have any chance of solving them? And so now, BridgeEmory is taking off, and I'm really excited.
And Emily, and then Ross.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Garcia. I am currently the president for BridgeUSA at Arizona State, and I also serve as the National Director of Youth Development for BridgeUSA. My Bridge story is much similar to everyone else's. Throughout my whole life, I grew up in a very politically, ideologically diverse family, but we never talked about politics. It was always something to where it was this elephant in the room of, we won't talk about this as a family because we won't be able to have those conversations. So when I first got to college, I didn't know exactly what I believed politically because I wasn't exposed to different viewpoints, and I didn't even really have any ideas of my own. So I remember attending the student fair where I talked to Josh Fixel, who was the founder of our chapter, and he said, I think you would love Bridge. He's like, you will have this opportunity to be exposed to these myriad of political ideas, and you might be able to figure out your own beliefs. So throughout my time at Bridge, I've been able to hear many different opinions about how American government should operate and what different policies and just viewpoints on life overall. And through that experience, it allowed me to truly identify some of my values and where I fall on the political spectrum. So I'm extremely grateful for Bridge and happy to be a part of the work that we do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ross Irwin. I'm the COO of BridgeUSA. And I first really just want to thank Greg for having me on, and thank Notre Dame for placing this emphasis on bridging that really needs to be happening in a lot more places than just the college campus. But I'm glad to see that we're starting and moving towards it. I got really into Bridge just because of kind of the differences in where I grew up and where I went to school. I graduated from UC Berkeley this May, and back in my hometown, it's very rural and very conservative. And I remember talking to friends and mentors and talking about, oh yeah, I'm gonna go down to Berkeley, and they said, you can't do that. Those people are crazy and they're stupid, right? I went anyways, and once I got there, I talked a little bit to friends there about the place that I'd come from, and they said, how'd you survive? Those people are crazy and stupid. And it really showed me that people that I really truly loved and cared for in different parts of the country with different ideas hated each other without ever knowing one another. And that's really when it became clear to me that this problem was big, right? And that we weren't going to get through it just by posting on social media or just a couple talks, but that we really needed to make a concerted effort to bring people together and to let them talk to one another. Because when it happens, people often find a lot more commonalities than they would ever expect. And so within my work at Bridge, I now help chapters across the country develop and do this work on campus, which is quite an honor. And I'm excited to see it go further.
Thank you all. And as you can see, we have a devoted panel. I'm very excited that we have them all. And Ross has also been a great help to BridgeND, and I know he's helped Bridge ASU and BridgeEmory. That's the work that he does. And so, Ross, I actually want to kick it off with you to sort of frame the discussion with sort of an easy question, but something that can ground us to why the mission is so important. So I want to know why BridgeUSA, why civil discourse, and why is this mission so important?
Absolutely. Well, Bridge is really working to develop the next generation of citizens that are empathetic, productive, and informed, right? Polarization racks this country. And I don't need to go into all of the parts of life that it's seeped into, but really it's making our democracy incredibly ineffective, right? We can't get through with the issues that matter, and we can't find ways to move forward. And so that's incredibly harmful to everyone in this country. And so there are a lot of different things that people are thinking about how to improve the system, right? Maybe it's a different policy, maybe it's a different way to vote, maybe it's something about money, maybe it's a specific representative. And those are all great things, and people should get involved in those. But fundamentally, we won't be able to move forward if we can't engage across lines of difference. None of these kinds of things will be put through if we can't work with one another, right? And if we can't talk to one another. And so fundamentally, what we want to focus on in Bridge is really building that culture of engaging across lines of difference, right? Having productive conversations about hard topics, because fundamentally, we have to change the way we engage before we can even really tackle these problems. And finally, what I'd like to say is, we've always kept BridgeUSA very student-run and student-focused. And the reason for that is that civic engagement efforts and events on campus are great, really, but we need students to take this work into their own hands and to own it themselves, because we need to be at the forefront. We need to take ownership over this country that we're merging into.
Thank you, Ross. And each Bridge chapter works towards that same mission. So I want to open this up to the group to ask, how does your Bridge chapter accomplish this mission? And how do you create conversations between individuals without it leading to infuriated and polarized individuals like we see in mainstream discourse? And I'll open that up to the group.
I think that's an excellent question, Greg. And I think the answer comes into is that if you create a space that is fully devoted to have these empathetic conversations with each other, and you encourage right off of the bat that this will be an area where no one will be judged for the different beliefs that they have, and it's truly a place to try and reach an understanding. In my experience, setting up the conversation with that first is going to attract individuals who genuinely want to understand maybe what someone from across the aisle thinks about them. So we have that already, great individuals who genuinely care about civic dialogue coming to our meetings. And then on top of that, we specifically train our board members to be able to moderate conversations so that they can be productive. I think that's always the most frustrating element of when you're talking in policy with someone, is that you leave the conversation frustrated and feeling like you don't even understand where they stand from. So being able to create an environment where we set up that empathy is the baseline of these conversations. And then two, having students who are trained in moderation on how to have these productive conversations really promotes great civic dialogue and for people to hear different perspectives without it reaching that elevated status.
If I can add to that, I think, creating spaces, I think, is one of the most important aspects of, what BridgeEmory does as well. And I think especially like in the current era when it's easy for like things like social media or like Facebook groups involving, your school to get very out of hand, for you to actually create a group that says, hey, we want different voices to disagree with each other. Like, we actually want disagreement, and we want it to be polite and we want it to be okay. That, I think, just creates the impression for people that, oh, okay, college isn't, what, for example, my parents were afraid it was going to be. There is still a place on campus where we can just talk about issues and not get, offended by something that someone says, or give the benefit of the doubt, give people grace. And to that end, we'll also try and invite speakers with very different views, or, just have discussions on very different issues with very different groups on campus, and kind of work from there to just like foster a better, culture for political dialogue on a broader scale as well.
Yeah, and Riya, I wanted to touch on you really quick because you have a unique role in student government where this is also your job. So I want to know how student government can play a role in ensuring proper political dialogue on campus.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about what our department's done so far this year. So it's brand new. It's kind of created during this election year. And we started out in the spring and summer working on a module on civil discourse and civic engagement for the Moreau first year experience curriculum. So this allowed us to ensure that the newest members of our community, many of whom are newly eligible to register and to vote this year, had the resources they needed to get engaged and learn how to be politically educated and active on campus. Something else major we did this summer was also create the political council, which Greg is also on, to bring together the leaders of each major political group on campus, including college Democrats, college Republicans, ND Votes, YAF, and of course, BridgeND. And so that was really great because it fostered a really good community of building on each other and working together to put out really cool events. So that's basically what we've been doing so far this year. And our goal going forward is to continue maintaining that environment of spirited political engagement, civic discourse. And I think the best way we can do that is by continuing to facilitate collaboration across clubs and organizations on campus this year, the way that we have so far.
Thank you. Bridge chapters always suffer some sort of blowback. And there's one particular issue relating to how we have conversations with people who might feel uncomfortable during the conversations. And as we know, Black Lives Matter protests stormed the country this summer and became a huge topic. And so I want to open up the discussion as to how can we have these conversations and how can we do it in a way, an empathy way, and a way to ensure that everybody at the table feels comfortable with the conversation. I want to know how you all sort of go about that and are able to accomplish that.
So if I may kind of push back on what you said about making sure everyone feels comfortable, I don't think issues like that are comfortable. And so I don't think the goal should be that, oh, let's avoid anything that's uncomfortable and keep it comfortable. I think we need to be willing to get uncomfortable. And so with BridgeEmory, what we did this summer was we collaborated with student government at Emory, as well as the Young Democrats, College Republicans, Black Student Alliance, NAACP, as well as the APITA activists. And we had a panel discussion on things like, police brutality, whether defunding the police is the right solution or whether, more body cameras is the right solution. Should we end qualified immunity or should we not? How can our universities help? And these aren't comfortable issues. And the way we kind of address that is that we told our panelists, we said, look, at some point, this will probably get tense. And if you need to take a moment just to process, turn off your camera, that's fine. We'll be right here when you come back. And, the discussion can just continue from there. And so quite predictably, when we got to issues like whether silence is violence, it did get uncomfortable. People did get tense, but we were ready for that. And so, you take a moment, you process, and you come back to the discussion, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is that we keep discussing the issue.
I'd also like to say that I think bridge spaces are very well suited for these kinds of conversations. Fundamentally, we're creating a space where people are respectful and empathetic towards people that they are not like, right? And something like that is incredibly important in these matters of identity and diversity, right? And I think what's really good about a bridge style discussion is it allows people to actually learn from people and hear people's experiences firsthand. There are a lot of diversity trainings that are very focused on just lecturing you about what's going on. And so often students tune out, right? And they're not listening. And I think it's really important to allow people to be able to engage with one another and actually hear things firsthand, because I think it really reinforces the learning that can come from that.
I think going off of Ross's and Jane's points about having these uncomfortable conversations and engaging with each other, especially coming out of a period of quarantine, to where really the only people we were having these conversations with was either our inner circle, people we were quarantining with, or most likely just our family. So the first things that we did as an organization is that we had a meeting surrounding everything that had happened, talking about Black Lives Matter and all of the different policy issues that were coming up, and if reforming was the right way or if abolishing was the right way, and brought people from these diverse backgrounds to actually talk to people that they hadn't been talking to throughout the summer with about these conversations. So having them engage with different ideas and different perspectives was monumental for our org. And I think it allowed everyone to better see the other side a little bit, but then also just be like, wow, okay, I'm not the only one that's feeling this way.
I think something that student government kind of does really well is supporting clubs and student groups on campus. And I think when it comes to identity and issues surrounding things that maybe not everyone on campus is on board with as well, it's important to kind of go to the clubs and student groups that are more suited and best suited to tackle those kinds of issues. So those groups know how to serve the needs of their members the best, and student government typically receives a good amount of funding in comparison to those groups. So providing resources and assistance to support them in any way possible is probably a good way to navigate things there.
Thank you. And I appreciate you sort of pushing back on my question, Jane, and all your answers. This is an important conversation because we see it play out in just about any conversation we're having nowadays. And going off of something that Emily, you mentioned, it's that there are points of views that not everybody is seeing. And we saw that with the Black Lives Matter protests. You would either see videos of peaceful activists and the police starting riots, or you'd see videos of the protesters starting the riots, depending on where you were at on the media markets. And so I want to transition to this question of the nichified media complex that we're living in right now. And I want to know how bad it is and how we can combat it either individually, systematically, and see how can we combat the media's inflammatory and divisive nature.
Well, I'll certainly say that this is a very tough question, with more data, more users, more access to users, there's going to be more diversification of that market, right? And people will be put into those buckets. And in fact, it really is profitable to put people in buckets. You know what their wants and their desires are. For that reason, you can advertise to them better, and there's a real motive for people to divide us. I don't know how to fix social media. And I think a lot of people are scratching their heads about that as well. In fact, we're having hearings about that right now in the highest court, So I think really fundamentally, we got to teach the skill of intaking different viewpoints willfully, right? And we also have to step outside of those bubbles and go talk to people one-on-one, because a conversation on social media, you'll get the worst of people. But when you talk one-on-one, you will see kind of, the better angels of our nature.
Yeah, I think this question is also, right, a two-part one. So first, how bad is it? I know my professors have to often remind me, for example, that Twitter is not the entire country. And so Twitter doesn't look great, but all you have to kind of do is step outside of that space and go talk to people on your campus. But nonetheless, media does pose a problem, especially in terms of the fact that we do consume different media outlets. Some people read the New York Times, some people read the National Review, and we tend to just consume the sources that we're most familiar with, that have the opinions that we're used to seeing. And so I think one way to combat that is either to just read different sources, or if you have trouble, doing that, talk to other people who read different sources. And in that way, just realize that if you think someone else's opinions are tailored by the media that they're consuming, you also have to ask yourself, how are your opinions tailored by the media that you're consuming? And in that sense, putting yourself in someone else's shoes that way, I think, is a good way to just make sure that we're thinking critically about these issues and not letting ourselves get swept up into, all of the things you see in media.
I think if I could add one more thing to it, this conversation about media is that don't just go off of what the headline says. So many times I get sent articles just because they're like, they only read the headline or they only read the first two paragraphs. Like, we to be frank, we have to be better than that. We have to be fully reading the articles and fully educating ourselves on these issues because they are important, and being educated is fundamental to our democracy and fundamental to coming up with creative solutions to these. So push yourself, challenge yourself to step outside of your comfort zone. I know sometimes I have to check myself and I have to check my biases, and some great organizations that are out there, such as All Sides, will tell you kind of maybe where a media is leaning in their biases, and definitely, step outside of your comfort zone to maybe go across the aisle or maybe only read centrist news. You have to pick the solution that you think is best for you. But I do think that every user and every college student has to be aware in some part. So I would be a huge advocate of even just media literacy classes. At ASU for Bridge, we held a media literacy workshop where we had one of the journalist professors come in, and she taught us about how headlines get made, how the 24-hour news cycle has affected the validity of news. So I think just having that knowledge also about how news is being created is important, so that you can read news from a more critical perspective of realizing that sometimes commentary is intertwined with facts. So diversifying where you're getting your news will help you decipher what is actually fact and what's kind of more commentary.
On that note that both Emily and Jane have referred to so far, after the last presidential debate, I think afterwards the NBC commentator mentioned something along the lines of, I didn't understand what President Trump was saying at a certain point. It sounded like Fox News speak solely. And they kind of had a little discussion about how if you don't watch that certain news source, then you just might not understand the lingo and the things that they're talking about. So that's a really good example of even people at the top of our democracy can get stuck in that kind of thing. But also on the topic of social media, I think it's really, really easy to get stuck in an echo chamber. You can block people or unfollow the ones that post things that you disagree with. You also have this whole thing of social media posts that are specifically tailored for you coming up on your feed. And I think it's really important to not take all of your news from your Daily Mail on Snapchat or whatever comes up on people's stories on Instagram these days. You have to actually look for the facts, just like Emily was talking about.
And Riya, I want to go off of that, and I'll pose this question to you first. We're seeing an increasing movement on social media that some are terming cancel culture, and it's unclear what we're referring to. So I want your opinions on what is cancel culture? How big of an issue is it? Is it an issue at all? What are its merits and what are its drawbacks? And Riya, I'll pose that question first to you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting phenomenon that's kind of emerged in the last year or so. And I think with regard to specifically political cancel culture, there is sort of this phenomenon of also performative social media activism. And I don't know how familiar everyone is with that, but things like there was the whole Blackout Tuesday during quarantine where for Black Lives Matter, people posted a black square on Instagram. People applauded those who did and said that those who didn't should be canceled. But then on the other hand, people were targeted for posting that and saying that that was not going to make any real difference, despite them having good intentions. So in that way, it's definitely dangerous, and it makes people feel like they can't continue to grow and share their own opinions and stuff. But however, in the same way, I do think that in a really odd way, it does allow for some accountability. So for example, if you're posting about the importance of wearing a mask and Black Lives Matter stuff on your Instagram stories, but then also posting pictures of you on your private yacht with 25 of your closest friends disregarding the pandemic and its disproportionate effect on the minority communities, it's clearly demonstrating a type of hypocrisy. And I think that's a good example of that kind of performative social media activism.
If I may add, in terms of how we define cancel culture, I think first of all, I think a lot of the discussion around cancel culture and a lot of the people who take issue with it are almost centering the wrong issue. They're focusing on, for example, oh, this celebrity got canceled for saying this thing, and how awful is that? And on the one hand, for that person, perhaps, yes, personally, it is not ideal. But at the end of the day, the celebrities aren't the people I'm concerned with. If Chris Pratt gets canceled for saying something, he will be fine. Colin Kaepernick is even fine. He's got, you know, deals with Nike and things like that. It's the general population who sees this and then starts to think, oh, shoot, I can't say the things that I might think because I might get canceled for them. And I don't have a ton of money or a job that I can just afford to lose. And I think that's the group that I'm more concerned about. I think Riya does make a good point that, you know, there is a certain level of accountability that comes with cancel culture, but I think it's a balancing act. And at least if you ask me personally, I don't think we've got the balance right. I think we have created, especially on social media, this environment that makes people think that they can't say the things that they believe. And on the one hand, that makes us feel more comfortable about things up until the point where those people who weren't comfortable saying their beliefs go to the ballot box and vote. And then the results don't look the way you expected them to. And why should they? People weren't expressing what they thought in public. And so what you thought you were seeing in the social media landscape just wasn't accurate. And so for me, I personally prefer to hear controversial opinions because that way I at least know that they're out there in the open and that I can address them that way. If they're just behind closed doors, I can't do anything about them. And so that's kind of the perspective I take on that.
I think cancel culture can also delve into this argument about free speech and who's allowed to have free speech and kind of even the limitations of free speech. So I think it's important that I'm not sure about the solution for cancel culture. I think it can, as Riya said, provide a level of accountability. But then I also feel as though that as Jane was mentioning, that it can be extremely dangerous. I think it can be extremely dangerous to college students who are afraid to voice maybe a counter opinion on their university. And then at that point, you are pushing people more into their echo chamber by canceling them than you are actually maybe like providing them a space to discuss these ideas. So I think it's important for us to have a healthy amount of respectful dialogue and be inviting of that even on social media. So I think engaging with ideas that maybe you don't agree with or diversifying your feed so that you don't fall into maybe an echo chamber is important. But I also will go back to a point that Ross made earlier about right off the bat, maybe having a political discussion over Twitter and Facebook isn't going to be the best idea to have. So I think that's important too, to just be wise about when you are going to be engaging with political ideas on Twitter and to just expect some pushback. I think we live in a digital age and we don't know who's looking at our Twitter feed and who's going to maybe disagree with us. So I think always post mindfully and be aware that, okay, somebody might disagree with me about this, but maybe this is something that I would rather talk to them about it in person, if it's specifically like that.
I think that these are all really fantastic points, and I just want to touch on a couple things. I mean, this cancel culture ignores the ability to learn, right? And I think fundamentally, if you're really interested in having a better society, whether, you know, whatever that looks like, you'd like people who disagree with you to be learning, right, and to be changing. But oftentimes, as Emily said, that doesn't happen. And then I think also, I just want to say, cancel culture is not its own phenomenon, really, in my belief, at least. I really believe that it's a symptom of our political identities becoming kind of paramount, right? Regardless of our other identities. And I think really it comes from this belief that we can just silence the other side into submission. And I think both sides of the political aisle believe that right now. And I think that really we shouldn't be thinking about cancel culture as a new phenomenon necessarily, but as a result of the increasing polarization and the hate that we have for people that disagree with us.
Right. Those are all great points, and I think that we're seeing cancel culture everywhere, starting to develop on all sides of the political spectrum. It's not exclusive to one side, and I think, Ross, as you said, that's sort of an indication of our growing polarization. And so, I wanted to ask, there's a rising distrust of institutions, particularly universities. It feels like that people are starting to distrust the university and the way they're teaching their students. So I want to ask you all, what do we make of this rise of distrust, and are concerns of indoctrination real and valid?
So if I may, when I hear stuff about university indoctrination, I assume a lot of the times that it does refer to many of the classes I tend to take that are focused on race and gender. And I do know people have this idea that, college students are going to go off to university and be brainwashed by the things that they're learning. And I guess the first thing I would ask is, have a little more faith in us than that. There are things we learn that, we think about critically and either agree with or disagree with. And, we are able to do that. That said, I do think there is some legitimate concern about, for example, the political tilt of universities. I do think, at least, the space I'm at, with Emory, there are certain things I learn where I think there's definitely some information missing here. But I'm still able to go and look for that information on my own and form a cohesive critical opinion based on that. But in terms of indoctrination, I think a lot of university students have the ability to think critically, and we should give a bit of credit for that, while at the same time just being aware that the source material is not always the most unbiased. In fact, I don't think a lack of bias is ever possible. And so just keeping that in mind and being able to understand that if your college is a more liberal leaning space, you have to take that into account when forming your opinions. That's something we're able to do. And when I talk to friends, I think most of us are trying to do that.
I'd like to say, I think, as Jane said, there's always a little bit of indoctrination. I mean, I looked up the definition, and the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And if you really want to stretch the metaphor, you could go as far to say, teaching about gravity is indoctrination, right? Because you will accept that without critique. And I think that within any teaching, some indoctrination is going to be happening, right? The trend that I'm really concerned with is orthodoxy, right? And a set of beliefs or ideas that are approachable, or a set of ideas that we will not touch, right? And I think that may be an even bigger problem on universities, is not necessarily that teachers are inputting or professors are inputting their own beliefs, because I think they will always do that, but really that they're saying broadly that, oh, we can't talk about that in this classroom, right? Or we can't approach that conversation. And I think having ideas that are allowed and aren't allowed is the part of a lot of society. But I think the span of acceptable ideas is shrinking very quickly to include just a certain set of beliefs. And I'm really worried about that, specifically the orthodoxy.
Right. And one more question before Q&A, and we'll go in the order of the introductions for this. I want to know, what can people do to get involved in this process of creating a better political climate on college campuses? And I know we have a lot of people who aren't students tuned in. So what can they do to help the youth out, to create these better environments among the youth and among political engagement? So we'll go Riya, Jane, Emily, Ross, as we did in the introductions.
I think to start off with what universities can do, specifically student governments, I think it's important, as I mentioned before, to support clubs and student organizations who have goals that are oriented in that way, specifically Bridge. But I think making sure that you're creating an environment that isn't hostile and open to discussion, and that you don't censor students like we've been talking about, is really crucial in that way. And while that might not fall into the realm of university policy per se, it is something that student governments and other institutions can do. And I would definitely encourage them to adopt a director of national engagement type of position like what we have here, because it's brought a lot of fruitful discussion and collaboration to our campus.
Yeah, so I'll also start in the university space and just say that I think first it's important that universities have, for example, open expression policies that allow for discussion of various topics. I know Emory, for example, has a very broad open expression policy. And so when groups invite controversial speakers, for example, they know that they're not going to be censored for that. But then going from there, it's also important to just contribute to the culture of the university in, creative ways. BridgeEmory is a good way to do that. I know I've also, been working with a friend to create a class where essentially it's just a discussion-based course where we talk about things like free speech and cancel culture and, the different ways that, for example, the Western canon versus ethnic studies are taught, and just understanding how bias kind of, infiltrates all spaces. And then I'll say outside the university, talk to people who are students, or if you have kids, talk to your kids and just understand you're going to disagree and maybe someone will change their mind, but it's not going to happen in one conversation. It's going to take months or years. And it just needs to kind of be a part of life that we accept, that we need to talk about these issues in a way that's fruitful and productive.
To echo what everyone's been saying, at a university level, I think universities need to be actively trying to establish spaces for students to come together to have politically, ideologically diverse conversations with each other, whether they are not comfortable with having those in political discussions just yet, starting off with something small, talk about food, different things like that, and then maybe like building up to a political discussion. But I think universities as a whole need to be allowing these types of discussions to be happening on their campus and even encouraging them to. So I think creating classrooms like Jane was suggesting that encourage dialogue between students and even with professors. I also think professors should be asking questions and in allowing students to possibly disagree with their ideas so that you do have this free of exchange of ideas. And I think pushing each other in that way to stretch your mind and really figure out what you believe, and then also being able to gain those practical skills of how do you engage with someone that you disagree with. I think that's something that we can always be learning and working on. And then I think outside of that, I think just from a family perspective, teach your kids to have these conversations, have these diverse conversations with them from a young age, talk to people that you disagree with, invite disagreement, and as we mentioned earlier, invite being uncomfortable. I think we get too familiar and too comfortable just being comfortable, and I think that can be dangerous.
My colleagues have all made really excellent points, so I won't hammer them too much, but I will say, join BridgeUSA, get involved, right? If you are a college student, you can start a chapter really easily. If you aren't a college student and you know one, let them know about what we're doing. We need to support the next generation in this, because if they don't get it, we're really headed down the wrong path, so start a chapter, bridgeusa.org. And I will finally say, and shamelessly, we have got a big red donate button that goes directly to students around the country working on this stuff. So you can help them very directly, very easy to Google. And thank you.
I forgot one last thing. Also, we are expanding into high schools. So be looking out for the BridgeUSA High School Ambassador Program. If you know of a high school student that wants to engage with different ideas and start these conversations young, as I mentioned, most people form their echo chambers before they even reach college. So if we can start these conversations at the high school level, then how much more equipped will this person be when they get to college to have these conversations? So if you want more information about that, you can email me after this, or even go to bridgeusa.org to find out more.
Excellent. There's a lot of cool stuff that goes on at Bridge at every chapter. I'm always impressed when we have our conferences, the different things that other chapters are doing, because I think Notre Dame does so much, and then I hear other stories about what other people are doing, and it's always incredible. But transitioning into Q&A, we have a question from Tom, and it's related to the political divide and how wide the political divide is on our campuses, and is it a problem? And I want to further that question to ask, do you face challenges with some of the events you put on? Do you face backlash, and how do you confront that? And so I'll leave that as an open question.
I think Notre Dame specifically is in a really interesting position with regard to this question. I think before I came to Notre Dame, a lot of my family and friends from back home would be like, where is that place anyways? But now with Mayor Pete as a major figure and Amy Coney Barrett emerging as our newest Supreme Court Justice, most people know not only where South Bend is, but they associate us with these renowned figures of national importance. And I think that we've been doing a really great job on our campus continuing to bring people together, and especially through Bridge's efforts, despite COVID and despite being in an election year. But I think tensions are incredibly difficult to address in some situations. So for example, with the Amy Coney Barrett nomination and prompt confirmation that followed. But I think, like Greg alluded to earlier, we had 2 demonstrations earlier today, one for support of her and one against. And the civility demonstrated there, because I was in attendance, was really, really interesting. And having these 2 groups in close proximity to each other, but still respecting each other, was really incredible to see. So I'll open it up to everyone else too.
Yeah, so I'll say at Emory that I think we have a bit of a different context. For instance, I know the young Democrats and the college Republicans here do not get along. We managed to bring them together for one event this summer, and then after that they said we're not working with each other, and so we're very much still working on that. So in terms of political divide, that's a very obvious example of it on our campus. But at the same time, again, it's something to work through. In terms of just general context beyond that on campuses, you know, in this course that I'm helping to teach, we actually had a guest speaker who came in and offered the suggestion that, is it a divide or is it conformity? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I think it's easy for different people to not necessarily get heated about their opinions, but simply to hang out around people who hold the same opinions. And I think that's something that a college campus sometimes makes it easy to do. And yet at the same time, for me, because I knew I didn't want to do that, I was also, you know, perfectly able to find spaces where I could talk to people who disagreed with me and have conversations about, you know, race, capitalism, things like that, and just disagree there. And so I think there is a divide, but I think it's easy enough to overcome if you look for those opportunities.
I'd also like to jump off that point about conformity that Jane's making, because I think that plays into it a lot. You know, students go to campus, right, and they've got 2 options between political clubs. They've got Dems, they've got Republicans, right? And I think a lot of students don't really identify with those groups, and they become less politically active, and they don't talk about it much. And I think often these really heated things that you see at campus is happening because the people who are engaged in politics there are very loud, they're very in your face, they're very unconstructive, where a lot of the student body is actually sitting behind the scenes and kind of watching it all play out. And I think Bridge has been really instrumental in giving those people a place to come and really showing that there are a lot of people on campus that want to talk about issues, but the current political orgs don't really allow for that.
I think jumping off of that point really quickly, there's a saying that we say a lot at Bridge ASU is that the left thinks that we're too far right, and then the right thinks that we're too far left. So you can't really win with either side when you're talking to them and trying to collaborate with young Dems or college Republicans, and not to any fault of their own. So I would say that there definitely is a political divide, and that I also think that people view bipartisanship as not really necessary and needed anymore. And I think that speaks volumes to just how our democracy has looked since the 2000s, and just being in a deadlocked democracy where normally the party that has the majority is the only party that's going to pass bills that session. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, is that college students are mimicking what we are seeing at a national level. So another thing that I would like to emphasize, though, is that typically when you can leave those groups, you will find the majority of students that do want to have these conversations. And I think that's why Bridge is so important, is because it's so easy to feel apathetic and to feel like you don't belong in the American political system, because it's portrayed as only these fringes, when I don't think that's an accurate description of what actual America is. I think America is very diverse, and I think there are some great people who act as great partisans for their party, and then I think there are great people who are somewhere in the middle and want to see more collaboration between the two.
Right, and I want to touch on, I invited a diverse people from different schools for a reason, because as Riya said, there's different political climates at each school. You know, we have Ross from Berkeley, and they make the news frequently, whereas Notre Dame seems to have a unique political climate on its own. So it's interesting to hear those takes. And I also wanted to say that Emily raised great points, and there's an aspect to a lot of people that think that Bridge is a centrist club, but it's very clearly not. We don't believe that the centrist is any more right than anybody who's maybe a Marxist or an anarchist, or maybe that may be more right than those people, that anybody can have an equal say is Bridge's mission. But a lot of centrists do show up for that reason that Emily brought up. And so moving on to a new question, Sam from South Bend is asking, how involved are minority students on your campuses in politics and also in your Bridge organizations?
So in short, I'll go ahead and say very involved. So in addition to BridgeEmory, I also help to lead the APITA activists, or the Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American activists on campus. And a lot of what they do is also just trying to educate the community on various political issues. Within Bridge itself, you know, both of our co-founders are from immigrant communities. And so I think, yeah, minorities are getting a lot more politically involved on campus, because a lot of the issues that we see in the news are something that we feel we have a personal stake in. And I find that personally, at least, very encouraging.
I think on Notre Dame's campus, it is a little bit difficult to make sure that minorities feel that they can be represented and can be vocal about the things that they care about. But I think specifically, like, you don't want to put people in a position where they know that they're going to be like a very extreme minority in a lot of situations, whether it's ideologically or by race or sexuality or gender. Well, not really gender way, but it's difficult to make sure that those people feel comfortable enough in this environment to come forward and share their opinions, even in a Bridge sort of situation. And I think one thing that Bridge and ND Votes on campus are doing together that I think will be really awesome is following the Converge model that we had earlier, that pairs people from different sides of the spectrum together to have a productive conversation. Doing that kind of thing in a dorm, kind of having civics in action is, I think, what it's called, but having these dorm communities come together, and you already know each other, you love each other probably, and having hard conversations with people that you know and already like, not just because of their political orientation, I think is going to hopefully help people feel like they're more able to have those conversations, especially minority students.
There's another question related to those people who aren't as involved in politics. And Emily, in one of your first responses, you did bring up that, you know, you have these great people who are very interested in politics showing up to the meetings. And for BridgeND, that's certainly true, that the nature of the people showing up are the people who are politically engaged. And so my question is to you all, and the question is along the same lines, is how do we engage those who might be apathetic, and how do we get those people involved? What events have you done? What else can be done in that regard?
I think the way to engage people who are already apathetic is showing them that they do have a voice and it does have power and that they do matter. So one of the ways that we do this at Bridge is that we collaborate with organizations that aren't necessarily strictly political, or maybe we'll like draw in different majors and not just your normal political science students. So one of the ways that we do this is through our Bridge the Gap event, where we will have professors from across different disciplines come and lead discussions on a variety of topics. We've talked about, I think veganism was something that we talked about, the lottery was something we talked about, all the way to the Electoral College, and then even identity politics. So in this room that we host this event, you have over 160 people attend, and then also these diverse organizations that are bringing in their people who maybe are not necessarily political. And once they start talking, they realize like, oh, you know, like talking about politics isn't always scary. And I think that's one way that Bridge can appeal to people who maybe feel lost in the political system, is by showing them that like, there is a space for you to come and just figure out what you believe. There's a space for you to come and just listen to people. And there's a space for you to also come and then voice your opinions, and people will respectfully engage with you. So I think that's one way to get people who feel disempowered by the system, is by showing them that Bridge is different. Bridge wasn't carved to fit into the system. It was made to fit outside of the system, and that it looks differently because it is different.
I'd also say, you know, we do a lot of work internally as well to make conversations and discussions approachable for people, right? And a lot of what you know that needs is talking about the underlying values and philosophy and inclinations behind policy, because if you get into, you know, section 30 of some law, you're really going to lose a lot of people. And I think it's really important when talking about politics, if you are really into politics, to make it approachable, right? And to make it, put it in terms that are understandable, and so that you can allow lots of different people into that conversation.
I think the last thing that I would just say is that a lot of people who seem apathetic about politics, I think just feel like, oh, I don't know enough to participate in this conversation. And I think it's important to just let people know that, first of all, there are a lot of people who read a lot of political sources and then talk about them and quite frankly don't know anything. So if you think, oh, I can't talk about this because I haven't read XYZ, that's just not the case. You have to start somewhere. And, you know, wherever you're at, people will always be willing to meet you there. And so just kind of getting over that initial intimidation is something that I think kind of reveals that people aren't as apathetic as it seems.
And one final question, so this will be the last question, and it's the specific question to Riya. Riya, we were supposed to host the presidential debate, and so we got a question that says, how sad are you that we did not host the first presidential debate? And what was the general feeling from students about that?
In short, very, very, very sad. I think Greg or Patrick, one of the co-presidents of our Bridge chapter, texted me before I read the email, just a sad face. And I was like, what happened? And then I open up my email and I see from Father Jenkins basically explaining why we can't have it. I was heartbroken. I was so excited, especially since our political council members would have been a pretty good part of that event. And especially to have it during a time where Amy Coney Barrett was nominated the week before it ended up happening. And say if by chance Pete won the Democratic nomination, if those three things happened together, that would have been insane. But it's okay. I guess South Bend got enough love recently, and Cleveland can have it.
And I'll say so myself that Riya and a lot of the students at Notre Dame and a lot of the faculty were working really hard over summer to prepare campus. And the moment that news hit, I know a lot of us had to take an hour out of our days just to like calm down. I went on a walk because I was like, I put in so much effort and everybody did, and it just all felt like it vanished. But a lot of the events still happened, which is good. So I want to thank tonight's panelists, and I think that you all are doing great work, and that the role of BridgeUSA, I hope it was evident tonight through our panel, is needed. That students are going to rise to positions of power. And the question is, do we want those students to arrive having engaged in civil discourse and with those tools? And that's vitally important, that when we arrive to those positions of powers, we arrive there with those tools to create a better political climate for our nation. And as we know right now, we're not doing too great, but that's going to be key towards a future generation of civil discourse. So thank you all for joining us for this final conversation ahead of Tuesday's election. We are living in unprecedented times, no doubt, dealing with a pandemic, deep political and racial divisions within our nation, and a presidential election that is almost certain to be contested, regardless of which candidate wins. So regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, I hope one thing we can all agree on is there's a need to respect one another's opinion, to engage in empathy, as Ross told us at the beginning of today's discussion, and have those meaningful conversations that divide us. And so I want to thank our panelists one more time for a lovely discussion. And I also want to thank you attendees for not only attending this discussion, but all the other ones that the provost office has put on. It's been an amazing series. And the last thing is to remember to vote. Thank you all.